you think you'd be interested in joining in. First up, I'll go over my talk here and a demo. Hopefully that won't cause too many sparks and flames coming out of my computer after I get done with it, and open it up for questions about this technology. So let's go ahead and kick it off. So PHP-PM basically stands for Process Manager, and what it is it supercharges your PHP application. So before we get too much into exactly what it is, let me just go over who am I. My name is Joshua Copeland. I'm the CTO of Remote DevForce. It's a software development shop. We do freelance PHP development. I've been running that now for about 5 years. And I've also been developing in PHP for 12 years and just software development in general for a little over 15 years. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've built a lot of startups, had a lot fail, but that's kind of the life of being an entrepreneur. And also, I'm a self-proclaimed computer, beep, and I'm a family man. I'm a tech lover. And I love skateboarding on some of my off time just to get some exercise and get outside and get that vitamin D. You can see my outdated blog, which I promise I'll start posting more at ogprogrammer.com, or check out my website, remotedevforce.com, if you are interested in either looking for freelance contracts or need somebody to help out with your project. Also, feel free to follow me on ogprogrammer at Twitter. So, what is PHP-PM? PHP-PM is an open source process manager, and basically what it does is it supercharges your PHP applications, and it's also a load balancer. And the way that it uses, or the way that it can supercharge your PHP application is by what really underneath the hood is React PHP, which achieves event-driven, non-blocking I/O with PHP. So in layman's terms, instead of every time a request going to your server where PHP-FPM needs to go and bootstrap your application and load all of those files, PHP-PM essentially has a hot loaded version of your application ready to take requests. So it doesn't need that boot up time, and that's really where you're getting the key performance out of. There are some caveats that I personally ran into with using this, but I wouldn't be surprised if people are using this in production. I think even if it's not quite there, this is definitely the future of PHP and what you can do to write some really performant applications. So, like I said, it's based on React PHP, and it works best with applications that use a request response framework like Symfony's HTTP kernel. This approach is it kills the expensive bootstrapping of PHP because it doesn't have to declare symbols, load, parsing, all those PHP files in the opcode, and basically allows your application to be loaded and ready to go to take requests. Essentially, it spawns a bunch of workers just like FPM does. So you have several PHP instance workers ready with your bootstrapped application, held in memory and ready to take new incoming requests. So this is what makes PHP so fast for serving up applications, requests for your application. So in some articles I've read, it shows with PHP-FPM taking like 150 requests per second and boosting that up to anywhere to 2K with PHP-PM. My benchmarks showed about 2 to 3x throughput, but I have a feeling a lot of that has to do with just my local environment, and probably, again, on a production environment, you could probably get that 15x that they claim that it could get. There is an integrated load balancer. There's also, for development reasons, a hot code reload feature. So just like when you're developing something in JavaScript or CSS, and you have an npm watch command sitting there watching for application changes or watching for changes in the assets and then rebuilding, this kind of does the same thing. It will monitor all of the PHP files. When it sees something that's changed, it will then just reload all of those PHP-PM processes. I'll call it PPM for now, just because it's a little bit shorter. But basically, that allows you to develop very quickly with this, so you don't need to use something different on your local environment for developing. And also, it can serve up static files fairly quickly. Personally, probably would want Nginx or something in front of this to serve it up and dodge PHP-PM, which would probably be a little faster, but it does have that as a feature. And like I said, it supports the HTTP kernel, which Symfony and Laravel pretty much support, and there's a bridge for that works with PHP-PM. Seems fairly stable from what I've seen and tested. And there are some experimental bridges that are out there, or I should say adapters. There's one for Drupal, one for Zen, one for Cake PHP. They're either all in alpha or beta stages right now, so they're experimental. But if you're looking to get that boost of performance and you don't want to rewrite everything in React PHP or Node, and you want just to bootstrap your application, perhaps take a look at those, and maybe you could contribute to those projects to get them to a stable state. But just know that those are out there so you can experiment with. So how do we use PHP-PM? So essentially, the easiest way to get started is, like all things in the world now, is using Docker. You can use Docker to load up PHP-PM by just running either the Symfony or the Laravel bootstrap command. So you can see here we've got -- bootstrap equals Symfony or -- bootstrap equal Laravel. That basically tells PHP-PM which adapter to use. I think by default the Symfony one, or aka the HTTP kernel, is what's loaded as that bridge and adapter. But like I said, there's experimental ones out there you can try. And then you need to tell it which directory is your web directory. And that's essentially because this is the PHP-PM Nginx flavor. There's also a PHP-PM Docker image by itself without the Nginx piece built into it. So if you want to separate that out, you can. But this is very easy to just run and get going. And I also have a demo and some examples you guys can take a look at if you want to run this yourself later. But we'll try and get to that at the end here. Here at the bottom left, we have PHP-PM Nginx. This is the actual Docker hub.
Second push one.
Let me hang on, sorry. And we also have the PHP-PM Docker GitHub here, which has great documentation as well if you actually want to build your own Docker image with PHP-PM. So let's just cover, it's not in this right here, but there is a debug flag you can pass in as well. When that debug flag is turned on, what that does is PHP-PM will be looking for PHP files that change. And when it does, it reloads all those PHP-PM processes. In production, you're not going to want that on. You're going to want debug off, so that way you get that extra performance of it not having to scan your PHP files all the time. But just know that underneath the hood, really, there's a binary called PPM. And that binary is really what launches React PHP and has all of those, has all of that built in. So here's what it looks like when you just run the ppm help command. You can see we have this bridge here that defaults to HTTP kernel. There's the bootstrap that we just covered. It says what type of bootstrap adapter to use, so essentially what framework that we're launching with PPM. And then a host and port, and this basically is defaulted to localhost and 8080, but you can change this, and like I said, this has this built-in load balancer. And then there's workers that get spawned off of this. For local development, you probably just want one. but you can default this. Essentially, you want it to equal probably the number of cores that you have in your system for the best throughput. And then the app environment, that kind of gets passed down to your application. So again, whether you want it to be dev or production or prod, excuse me, you'll pass in those flags, and that'll help your application to kind of switch from prod to from prod to oh shoot, where's my notes? Sorry about that. Second view. Okay, sorry about that. So let's go to the next slide here. So once you actually launch the PHP PM binary and you start it, you'll get kind of an output here that shows you what settings are currently set up for it. And then you can start to see the requests coming through for anything that gets requested to your application, essentially. So the basic features of it, like we covered earlier, you have a bridge that's default to the HTTP kernel. You're more than welcome to write your own adapter to your application, but you just need some sort of request response abstraction like PSR12 or something like that that's already built in. That's why it already works with Symfony and Laravel quite easily. So let's keep going here. How do we get more performance out of PPM? There's the app environment equal prod. You're going to want that on for your production environment, as well as making sure that you don't have Xdebug or anything silly like that installed. And then you're going to want to make sure that you flip debug to 0. So this turns off the hot reload, so it's not having to search all those files. And also passing something like -- logging off. You'll probably get a little bit more performance, but you won't have any logging. So you might want to have that on, depending on how you have this set up. But we'll go over some architectures of how you probably would want to use PPM in your production environment. Again, there's the -- workers. That's what you're going to use to control what the total CPU count is. You don't want to include hyper-threading or how many threads that you could possibly have. Just try to set that to how many cores you have. So I have a quad-core i7. I just set that to 4 or 5. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but just enough to kind of match exactly how much cores you have to get the best performance out of PPM. To get even more performance out of it, you could try a different event loop. I haven't looked too much into this, and I won't claim that I'm an expert on asynchronous PHP, but there could be some additional benefits you could get out of looking into the React event loop and perhaps some different event loops that could be quicker for what you're doing. So I wrote up a little example. There's also a couple of other examples out there, but I noticed they're a little out of date. So I wrote up one using PHP 7.4 and Laravel 7.12. And then I ran some benchmarks myself on my local. And I will say I got more performance out of using PHP-PM. However, I didn't look too much into it. I did get some requests that bombed out. I don't know if it's because maybe Siege was letting go of the connections before it got a request, but just know that, again, you probably want to benchmark this and make sure that it's stable before you actually throw this into production. So this is basically what I have in my docker-compose.yml inside of that GitHub project, which I'll share that in the PHP meetup on our meetup.com page. I'll share both the slides here as well as the GitHub repo. So inside of the docker-compose.yml, you'll see that we have this service here. And there's essentially two services that are running in this docker-compose.yml. There's a PPM, and there's also an FPM with an Nginx container. So this is basically just kind of my example setup I did so I could benchmark both running at the same time. You probably would want to actually benchmark it, you know, in a production environment or whatever. But locally, I just did it just for kind of understanding, you know, what kind of throughput I could get by using this. Over here, I've got some dev configs. So you can see this debug =1 flag here. That's really what's saying if you see PHP files change, go ahead and reload my processes. And of course, your app-env, which will throw your debug bar and all that good stuff. And then what's your public directory you want to serve up? So, you know, as you would have, there's a volume that gets mounted. So the root of this project just gets mounted over to var www. I'm using the PHP-PM Nginx flavor of this image. There are just specific ones for the PPM binary itself. That's probably what you would want to use in production and then separate out Nginx. But just as for sake of making it easy, I just use that one. And then this is the FPM. So I just kind of Googled, you know, PHP FPM Docker. I found this Bitnami image here, grabbed that FPM, and I grabbed this Nginx Bitnami. So this one I've just hosted on a different host port, 8888, instead of the 8080, which the other one is hosting 8080 on for our PPM process. And this one will be running PHP FPM, which FPM is great. You're gonna get a heck of a lot more throughput with FPM than you would be using something like mod CGI, you know, with a built-in PHP into Apache or something like that. That is kind of old school, but does offer some additional security features. Like if you use that with SU exec on a Linux box, and it's like a VM with other people on the VM, you can lock that down a lot more than you could like a PHP FPM. Gets kind of messy where you'd have to have different users and such, whereas the other way is perhaps a little bit more secure. So security, again, always should be at top of mind. But for the sake of this example, here's the FPM process, and we just got a little network that bridges these two containers, and a server.conf, which is what Nginx uses to basically see what port and what else you know, files to host up as the root directory, which is app here. So when I launch this and I run docker up -d, so it's running daemonized, I get this nice output from the PPM container. And what this tells me is what bridge and all the settings that PPM is using. So I'm using 10 workers. Again, I probably should have had that lower, but by default, I think it was set to 10. And you've got your app-env, which you should have set to prod. If you're using this in a prod environment, you want to get that extra throughput. Logging is turned on. Your public directory, wherever you're hosting your static files, and how many max requests this thing could take, and then your execution time, some timeouts. So this reload timeout, perhaps this is where I was getting some of my issues, but we'll get to it in a minute, one of the cons of using this. But just know that there's a reload timeout, and when this timeout is hit, PHP-PM will just die and then relaunch itself because it assumes that the request has taken too much time and that this process has had a memory leak. And that's kind of one of the issues with this. And we'll get to that in a second. But there are probably ways you can get around that, especially if you write a really well-written application that doesn't have any memory leak. You might not have to worry about that. But 10 to 1, if you live in any normal environment, you probably have some level of memory leak. So here's kind of some of the benchmarks that I ran locally. Again, this is going to vary. Every time I ran it, I got different numbers. So, it probably just matters what time of the day, what's running on your machine, etc. But I did run this with Siege and Apache Bench just to kind of get an idea of PPM versus FPM. I've got like I mentioned, I think a 2.5 i7 Mac here with 16 gigs of RAM. I don't know how much I gave to Docker, probably like 10 or something like that, something crazy. But I don't have like that beefy of a machine. But again, I did see performance boosts between PPM and FPM. However, I think that there was memory leak after a while, perhaps with the way that I have the Laravel app set up, that there were failed transactions. And obviously in a production environment, you would want 0 failed transactions because every request matters, right? So this, with FPM, I was hitting 260 transactions, and I was getting anywhere from, let's see, the longest transaction, it was around 6 seconds. Quite long, but still it wasn't too bad compared to some of the weirdness I was getting with PPM. But I did get almost 800 requests out of PPM. So what is that, 260? That's like 2.5 times more requests or something like that I got through PPM. However, there were 15 of those transactions that failed. Again, I have a feeling that those were just unfortunate requests that hit this 30-second, memory leak timeout, and it killed those processes and relaunched. There's probably a way that you could get around that and fix that, perhaps by reloading those once memory gets up to a certain size or something. But I'm sure reaching out to that PPM project, I probably could find a reason why that was happening. But I will say, with the throughput I was getting, was pretty impressive. However, it wasn't what they were claiming with the 15x, but again, it could just be the way that I have this project set up. These were pulled from blog posts that they kind of wrote. This is very old, back in 2014. However, you can see that PHP Nginx with FPM, they're claiming against PPM with 20 workers, was blowing FPM out of the water. Again, what they used for those benchmarks, I'm not quite sure. They're saying they use 7 with opcode cache. I don't think I even have op cache enabled. Maybe that's one of the reasons why things are blowing up on my machine. But there's obviously some things you could additionally tweak to get some more performance out of this. But with their Laravel 5 example, which they also do have a GitHub out there with this Laravel 5 example, you can see that PPM versus FPM, they're just getting so much more throughput. So in this example, hitting some articles, blog page sort of thing, they're getting, 491 requests. And then through this PPM, they're getting 1,300. So, I mean, quite a huge, a little over 2.5x, around there, 2.5x performance increase. So another graph here, the FPM kind of here at the bottom. Again, these are old. I'm sure there's been some better improvements in not only FPM, but with React PHP, Nginx, and all. And this has HHVM, which really, to be honest, isn't really used other than maybe by Facebook at this point. But you can see here the concurrent amount of connections that you have. There are some performance hits you start to get with React when you do get to that high concurrency level. However, it's still handling more requests than FPM is. So albeit it looks like the more requests that it gets, it has to do more shuffling, and it gets it starts to dip. I'm sure that could be handled with horizontal scaling or some other way of load balancing how many requests a particular server is getting. But as you can see, it definitely is a higher throughput than FPM is. And the memory usage, that is another con that I've seen, is React, again, over how many connections are coming through, it's having to load and hold all that application data in each one of those processes, especially when maybe one request loads a bunch of files that the next request isn't going to load. Those are just hanging out in memory, sitting there. So that's why you kind of see this steady upward trend with React, because it just holds on to that until eventually, like I said, those processes reload and it kind of clears itself out. So debugging, again, like I mentioned, if you get some strange issues in your application, you have no idea what they're coming from, try just dipping this down to one worker instead of having 8 or whatever running. There's also the verbose flags, V or double V, that you can enable to get some more output from PPM. You can also use PPM with Xdebug. Just know that PPM uses at least 2 processes. So that also means that there's going to be 2 Xdebug instances that get kicked off when you're using this thing. So with PHP Storm, there's a per default configured out the gate where it only allows you to use 1 connection at a time. So you're going to want to bump that up if you want to get Xdebug working with PHP Storm. And you can see here underneath the debug in PHP Storm, you can set that max simultaneous connection to something like 5 or whatever. That way you can debug those multiple threads coming through that PPM is running. There's a few adapters, like I mentioned in the beginning, that are out there. There's Laravel and Symfony, which seems fairly stable since it uses the HTTP kernel. There's also some experimental ones out there. There's one for Zend, there's one for Cake PHP, and there's also one out there for, that's slipping my mind now. Drupal, yeah, that's what it is. So those are all experimental. You probably don't want to use those in production unless you really went through those adapters with a fine-tooth comb. However, there are those options out there if you are using those frameworks. If you do use this with Symfony, just remember that you're going to be behind a reverse proxy, so you just need to make sure that you set your reverse proxy IP to be trusted by Symfony. Otherwise, you'll get some errors. And I have some bad news for all you WordPress developers, but this is not going to work with WordPress. Not now, not tomorrow, probably not ever. This is due to the lack of that request response abstraction, because WordPress doesn't use something like the HTTP kernel, or to be honest, any PSRs for that matter. So it is probably not going to happen anytime soon to use something like this. Now, that's not to say WordPress couldn't eventually take advantage of maybe some of the async abilities that libevent is going to provide with PHP in the future. However, right now, probably not going to happen. So that's great. We got a whole bunch of extra requests, and PPM looks great on paper, other than maybe some of the issues that I ran into, which is memory leak. So memory leak, memory leak, memory leak. That is the #1 issue that you're going to have with this. So if your application's bloated, has a lot of memory leak, not very good garbage collection sort of things, this is going to be something that could cause issues, but it's not that big of an issue, seeing that the workers are restarted automatically once there's a timeout that reaches that 30 seconds. That's probably maybe why I was getting some of those errors. Maybe if you had the request timeout at something like 60 seconds, but then you had the restart timeout for this memory leak issue at 30, that way it can maybe still serve up the response before it went and restarted. That might be a workaround or something like that. But again, I'm not an expert in using PPM. This is kind of experimenting with it. So you'd have to kind of try yourself and figure that piece out. This doesn't work with the extension event loop, so don't install PHP event, but you can try the lib event. loop. Those apparently will work. Again, I don't know 100% all about that, but that's some of what was in the documentation. Drupal and Laravel, or excuse me, Drupal and Zend and the Cake PHP are very experimental and not fully working. You can see most of the issues that those have by just going and looking at their GitHub. You'll see things like CSRF or like cookies aren't quite working. So perhaps you could look at ways of fixing that if you did want to use something like this. The Laravel debugger also isn't working perfectly since it still needs to reset some stuff after each request. So that could be an issue. But again, maybe you don't need that because you're just looking to use this in production. Also, streamed responses are not streamed yet, and there's no Windows support due to the way that signal handling works. So sorry, Windows users. So how you probably want to set this up in production if you did decide to experiment with it or even use it is, you have all of your clients making a request over to an Nginx server or maybe multiple servers or a load balancer or whatnot in front of your PHP application. And then you would load essentially your React PHP load balancer, this PPM process, and it would launch a bunch of workers, which are those PHP forks, and those would be what's serving up your application. So when you have a static file that gets requested, you're not hitting any of this PHP stuff. You just go and make that local file system request. But if you do get a PHP request, that's when you go ahead and hit your React PHP or PPM process there. And essentially that's going to be running all these asynchronous, hot-loaded, bootstrapped applications, so you don't have to have that heavy load of loading your application every time. So demo time. Let's try and break some stuff. So let me go ahead and pull up my demo here. I need to make this smaller. Put this over here. So here you have the Laravel application that I just loaded, which has PHP 7.2. It looks like I thought I was using 7.4, but I could be wrong. I could be using something like 7.2. That's probably just because I'm using 7.3 locally. But you can see I've got Laravel 7.12 installed here. This is the docker-compose.yml. This is what's using the PPM Nginx, and this is also what's using the FPM. So to kick it off, you can go and take a look at the README, which has some instructions on how to use this thing. So as long as you got Docker Compose installed, and then you can install something like Siege or Apache Bench with Brew and use some of these commands here to do some load tests against your local or remote environment or wherever. And to launch this, we just simply need to run this Docker Compose app, which I think I've already got this running, but let's go ahead and take a look here. Just bring it all down. So we'll run Docker Compose up -d. I just passed a -- build flag just because I was making a lot of changes to this and wanted it to have the freshest files. And we can tail our logs here, and you can see here's kind of our PPM output that tells us exactly what information is being loaded for the PPM binary. So, we can take 1,000 max requests, here's that max execution time, and that reload timeout. Those, again, you probably want to play with. You could probably find some articles on better tuning that. But anyway, so we've also got our FPM process that loaded here along with Nginx. So if we take a look at the Docker Compose, we can see that the PPM process is running on 8080, And then we've got our Nginx with FPM running on 8888. So if we want to do some load tests now, let's go ahead and I'll copy my command from the README here. First, let's load test the FPM container. So we're going to be running 10 concurrent connections and 1,000 requests. This will take a bit, but we can launch another terminal here, paste that in, and it's benchmarking. So while that's running, let's just go take a look real quick. I want to show you one thing here, part of this example. Everything in here, like I said, it's just a Laravel 712 example. There is a couple of files I added. I added this docker-compose.yml, which obviously has PPM and FPM that we just went over. There's also this server.conf. This is the Nginx configuration. So this is what's telling it what the root public directory is and what, Docker container to look at for FPM. But this is just a really simple example to use like Nginx and FPM with that Bitnami package there. So those are really kind of the only bits that I added on top. The .env I just went and committed just because there's nothing that secret in there. I just copied the example over. So you can just clone this down, run composer install, and then you can test this out yourself once you bring the Docker containers up. So something happened. That didn't look good. Hang on, let's try that again. Maybe closing that caused issues. So Apache Bench is doing its thing here. If we look at the logs here, you can kind of see it rolling, all these new requests coming in because Apache Bench is just blasting it. So again, we're testing the FPM one first here. And just to kind of double check ourselves, the configurations for PPM I've got set to a little bit higher than I should, actually. I've got 20 workers, no logging, prod, and debug flag off, so it's not checking for any file changes to reload the processes. In reality, I probably should lower that. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a little bit more errors than we did last time, but we shall find out. So with FPM, I was able to get, here's kind of, I think, the main number I'm interested in, how many requests per second. About 15 and a half requests per second I was getting with the FPM process. If I run Docker PS here, just kind of show you what's running. It's these 3 containers. We've got our PHP-PM Nginx container, and then these 2 containers here kind of attached to each other for FPM, serving up FPM. So now let's go ahead, let's try to do an Apache Bench against our PPM process. So I'll kick that off, and now we could start to see, probably, oh, I have logging turned off, so we probably won't see anything there in the logging. But again, that's probably why you would want to put Nginx in front of this and have PPM as a separate process, because you don't want this container doing too much. Just have the PPM do its job and then throw native Nginx in front of it or something like that to serve up the request, and not even bother hitting PHP if it's a static file like CSS or a JavaScript file that's being requested. So this feels like it's going a little faster than the FPM was, so that's probably good news. So we're almost there. Come on. Come on, 1,000. Big bucks, no whammies. Almost. Almost. Come on. Oh, that's always the last 100 that takes forever, huh? So I'm getting 15 requests per second through, which I think is the same. That's probably not good. And I bet that has to do with the fact that I have 20 workers running. Let me see if lowering that down will do anything. Let's run 5. And let's reload that. A lot of other stuff going on too, like streaming and all this other stuff. So that might be a reason why we're getting the same benchmarks. But I did include some benchmarks that I ran before I had all this stuff running. And you can see with Apache Bench, I was getting, with PPM, about 11 requests per second. And then FPM, I was getting about 6 requests per second. So it was about double. And then with Siege, I was getting, with 30 seconds, just running as many requests I could during that 30 seconds, about 800. And there was 260 with the FPM process next to it. Let me try this one more time and see if we can get a different number there. All right, 80. Let's try that again. And like I said, by no means, oh shoot, I should not have ran that. Did it kill it? I just stopped. This is why live demos are never fun. No, they're both up. Okay. So this was, I think, a part of the reason I was getting some of these dead requests with Siege, perhaps even Apache Bench is hitting some of those. Essentially, I think it's like where PPM hits some certain threshold and then just decides to restart the process. So again, you probably have to really set up PPM properly. The good thing is you can actually create a config file for PPM. You don't have to pass in all of these flags. You can set an environment variable to tell it what config file to take a look at and then mount that over into the container. So there's ways that you could kind of set this up to where you don't have to have all these crazy flags going in. They just recently, and we'll get to that here in a second, but React PHP isn't necessarily still being maintained as much as I'd like. Their 1.0, I guess, or you'd say stable release was about a year ago, but there hasn't been any new tags released since then. I'm not sure if that's due to just maybe not a lot of development going on in it, or perhaps there's another framework out there that's doing a little more than it is. But that is one thing to note, that again, the stuff probably could just be that there needs to be a little bit more development put into some of these things to smooth out some of these bugs. But yeah, so we're getting seven requests per second. Again, it's not really the numbers I was looking for, but it's probably because I've got a ton of stuff running here. But I encourage you to go ahead and pull this down, run your own benchmarks, play around with it, and you could probably see that you'll get about 2x between FPM and PPM. But you got to play with some of those settings to kind of get it just right compared to how many cores you have. So let me go back here to the slides. There's just this last conclusion slide here pretty much. So just to wrap things up and recap, this React PHP, hasn't had a new release in over a year. So that's one thing to take into consideration. However, this is kind of the future of PHP if PHP is to stay relevant and keep up with technologies like Node and other, non-blocking I/O sort of languages that are out there. So one big thing that's still kind of a problem, obviously, since you've got the whole application bootstrapped and all of these requests going through, is memory leak. So that's something that you need to make sure that your app is stable before you go and obviously push this into production. And maybe you even consider rewriting parts of your application in React Native or Node.js. But just be aware that with this sort of callback behavior, you can run into callback hell, as what it's called. So, there's some trade-offs that you have with asynchronous applications. So I'm going to open it up for questions if anybody has any questions.
I don't have a question as much as just to kind of add something to what you were saying earlier is I think the reason why the development for React PHP is kind of slowed down is just due to the fact that there's better tools out there that are kind of coming out like Swool. And I believe I've heard that there's somebody else that's trying to do the same thing that Swool's doing, but in a more PHP-like syntax rather than trying to kind of rip off Go with PHP syntax. But I haven't heard very much about that other than like one Reddit post. But yeah, Swool is definitely the one that's taking the lead on this asynchronous PHP style programming.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I've heard a lot about Swool and some talks around it. So perhaps maybe even somebody, either creates a new sort of PPM sort of thing that, is like Swool that can kind of take advantage of that HTTP kernel and do the same thing here. But I will say this thing does work. It just probably needs a little bit more TLC before it's production ready. However, it's definitely impressive, the numbers I was getting, just kind of messing around with it shortly here. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had one question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I've been driving, so I haven't been really watching the screen, but you mentioned quite a few times that this is kind of a new technology, but then you mentioned one article that I think you said was 2014.
Yeah.
Where it was comparing it to FPM.
Yeah.
So, I mean, has it really been out since 2014 and they're just not ready yet?
No, well, it just, like I said, last year, so what's that, 2019, React PHP finally got its 1.0 stable tag. So technically speaking, React is now stable. When this first came out in 2014, it was just kind of the new hot topic. A lot of articles came out about PPM. So since then, it has had a lot of traction. And I think even looking at the repo, there was like somebody that changed something 20-something odd days ago. So PPM itself still seems to be under development. It's more of React PHP, which is under the hood of PPM, that seems to have slowed down. So I've heard people use this in production. In fact, one of my clients was even kind of like urging that we should look into this. However, again, you just need to probably load test your application first, just to make sure that you don't have some crazy memory leaks where this thing just basically restarts itself every time you have a request coming in, because then you lose all the benefits of having your application bootstrapped and ready to take requests if it's having to restart the application on every request. So again, you're going to have to just kind of test it with your application in order to see if your application will work well with a technology like this. Otherwise, FPM is probably going to be your best bet anyway. So that's just from what I've heard. And yes, it's been around now for about 5 or 6 years, so it's stable enough. Any other questions? Alrighty. Well, again, I'm Joshua Copeland. Appreciate you all listening to me blabber on about this. I just wanted to mention that at Remote Dev Force, I'm looking for freelancers that want to do Symfony and Laravel work. got a lot of work there. So if you do have experience, feel free to reach out to me at josh@remote-devforce. And I appreciate everybody's time, so thank you. All right.